tell us your name and share anything with us that will help us get to know you a little bit better.
Okay, so my name is Tom Banks, and I'm a professor of physics at Rutgers University. I grew up in Brooklyn, New York. I went to college out west in Oregon. I went to MIT, and then I got married and went to Israel for 12 years.
Oh.
And then I came back, and I've in the States, I've had jobs at the University of California at Santa Cruz and at Rutgers. And I've been working in the same field all of my life, and I'm not sure what else I can tell you.
What field is it?
I'm a theoretical physicist. I work in particle physics and cosmology.
Okay, for those of us that don't know any of those words that you just strung together right there, can you tell us what that is in plain English?
So particle physics, if you start looking at matter, the smaller you look, you get down to things called molecules.
Yeah.
And then the molecules are made of atoms. And then the atoms are made of protons, neutrons, and electrons. And then it turns out protons and neutrons are made of something called quarks. And so particle physics is the study of the very smallest constituents. And we don't yet know what those are. We just know what we've probed so far, because so far we keep finding more structure as we go down. We believe that our current theory might actually go down to very, very tiny distances, but we don't know that for sure.
How long have you been doing this work?
I started out really in the early 1970s as a graduate student. That's when I first started writing papers in this field. And I've been writing ever since then. I've written probably close to 300 papers by this point in my career. I haven't counted lately.
Has the discipline evolved from when you were in graduate school to where you are now? Has there been incremental or great massive change in what you understand about theoretical physics?
Yeah, there's been tremendous change. When I was going to graduate school, the main mathematical tool that we use nowadays to study these things, something called quantum field theory, was in disrepute. It wasn't clear. It was clear it was good for some things. People had ideas that there was something wrong with it. During the 1970s, there was a big revolution. Many people contributed to it. A few people got Nobel Prizes out of it. I was sort of on the young end, so I contributed only very little to that revolution. But we now have a theory that's almost too good, in the sense that it can explain every piece of experimental data that we see, but there are lots of hints in it that there's something missing, lots of things missing. And we've been trying to struggle with figuring out what's going on. Back in 2012, the last missing piece of that theory was found, the thing called the Higgs boson, was found in Geneva. And so that theory seems pretty correct, but we don't know what deeper layers there are than that. And we have been struggling because we haven't discovered anything else that contradicts that theory. We have all kinds of theoretical ideas that might be correct, except we haven't found any evidence for them. So we don't know what's going on. So it's a very peculiar time.
What's the impact of your work on humankind? So is it something we're looking more at the atmosphere, the environment, or is it specific to human beings? Where does it fall in the spectrum of life?
One of the big lessons of theoretical physics is you can't tell about these things for maybe 100 years. So to give you my favorite example, in 1916, Albert Einstein invented a theory called general relativity. And at the time, all it did was it explained some little tiny effect in the motion of the planet Mercury some little tiny effect in what happened when you looked at light coming around the sun, and a couple of other things. And as time went on, it started explaining more things in astronomy. But one of the things that it predicted was that when we shot satellites up into space to make GPS locators, that there would be an effect of that theory that was not taken into account in any prior theoretical framework. So I don't remember exactly when GPSs first went up, but the engineers who built the satellites and the GPS system weren't really sure whether to believe this highfalutin theoretical physics. So they had a little switch where they could switch on the circuit that would correctly implement the calculations from Einstein's theory or not, just to see what would happen. And it turned out you need that. So none of the GPS positioning and the timing information and weather information that we rely on today would be there if Einstein hadn't invented this completely theoretical thing that explained a few things that are not too interesting to most ordinary people. And similarly, the discovery of quantum mechanics, which is one of the subjects I work on a lot, which explained lots of things about the structure of the atom and so on and so forth. So that was first kind of intuited back in 1901, and then there was a big revolution in 1926 when the theory really began to be understood. It wasn't until the 1950s that people started building devices. And now every single thing that you interact with every day, every computer, every cell phone, everything completely depends on understanding quantum mechanics correctly, because you wouldn't know how to build them and how to explain the properties of the electronics without understanding quantum mechanics. So these things take time. And the stuff that I've been doing for most of my career is probably going to take more time, because it has to do with things that are more and more remote from what we normally encounter on Earth. Okay.
And just for the benefit of our audience, GPS is Global Positioning Systems. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Yeah. So I want to ask you a question that's really not related to what we just talked about. So there's been a lot, I mean, for years, the question between whether science is real versus other kinds of things like religion and evolution and all these kind of things. And it seems like now the world is kind of starting to look back at science and saying that the science is real, that what we know scientifically has more evidence than what we know evolutionary, if that makes sense. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, so I, like most scientists, I never believed any of those stories about science not being real. We've known for many, many years professionally that science is real in the sense that see, the scientific method was invented back in, it started in medieval times with Francis Bacon and so on. But it's really a really remarkable method, because its purpose was, we're not just going to think up some idea and decide that that's right, but we're going to think up some idea any way we can. And then we're going to figure out how to test it. And we're not going to believe it until we've tested it again and again. And it always gives the right answer. Okay. And then the most remarkable thing about that is that people started doing that, you know, Newton and Galileo and so on and so forth. And all the theories that they invented, which they tested and which worked really well, turn out to be wrong at the level of concepts. So if you actually write down what we believe today is the best kind of theory that you can think about, you won't see any of the equations Newton wrote down. You won't see any of the things that Galileo said exactly. But you can show theoretically that there are certain limiting situations in which they'll take place. and it will, things will be described by those things. Conceptually, it's all completely wrong. But because it was science, because it was built to agree with experiment, it can't be wrong in the domain where it was originally tested. And in fact, the new theories, the better theories, are so much more complicated that we would never think of, for example, using quantum mechanics to describe a car driving along the street or a baseball flying through the air. It would be ridiculous. It would be overkill to use this theory for that. So that's one of, for me, the greatest evidence that science is real and that it's a better way of thinking about those problems that you can think about scientifically than any other possible way of doing it, because it's just based on saying, I don't believe it until we've tested it, and somebody else can come along and say, no, wait a minute, we didn't do this test, and find something wrong, and then you have to tinker with it and fix it up. And sometimes those fixes are small, sometimes the fixes are a big conceptual revolution. But it just always steadily progresses in that sense, and you don't, the so-called wrong old stuff is not really wrong. It's just approximately true. And so that's really why I think of science as more real than, you know, some political theory that we might agree on now, but 100 years from now we'll decide, no, that wasn't really the right way people should treat each other.
Right. When I was getting my doctorate degree, when I was working on my thesis, you know, you propose your hypothesis and you have to prove whether your hypothesis is true or not true, and evidence has to support whichever, whether it's null or whether it's true. You have to keep proving it over and over again. And of course, I'm not a physicist or work in medicine at all. I'm a technologist, but the theory has to come back to the same outcome every single time. If it doesn't come back to the same outcome, either your scientific development and analysis is wrong, or the theory you're trying to prove is wrong or right, one way or the other. And it has to be that consistently over and over and over again.
Right.
Yeah. Well, that's good to know. So I'm gonna ask you a question, probably not that falls in the physics world, but so there has been a lot written about what's the differences between ethnicities. And this kind of leans toward the evolutionary side and questions the scientific side. So what I've read to date, they say that between every single ethnicity on the planet, we have 99% in common, just that one thing that's not. And a lot of people question whether that's our real outcome, a real observation. Can you really make that statement? You know, can you really take this? And so when you look at the structure of DNA and genetics and all of these different things, you know, there are a lot of things that tells you, but it's not sure whether that's giving you evidence of whether that's what it really is. So I'm a 5'7" Black woman, born in New York, Brooklyn, and raised in South Carolina. And I have all the relatives that are in other parts of the world. How do I know that I am a part of them other than just I may have been raised in that family, or I may have done something? So with DNA and genetic testing, does it really validate that theory that we are all 99% in common?
Well, I think there's a real difference between DNA and what people turn out to be.
Mm-hmm.
So there are other things that happen, developmental things. So even with identical twins, even coming out of the womb, there are differences that come about because they had a slightly different environment. And so it's also clear that after people are born and they grow up, there are all kinds of stresses on them in their environment that are different for different people. And I think, you know, the question that's kind of hiding behind what, you know, why is anybody interested in this scientific debate? It's kind of because of our history of racism and the fact that we have had, you know, lots of people over human history saying, oh no, this kind of people, they're not as good in some sense that was supposed to be. And my feeling is there are undoubtedly differences, okay? I think, the fact that you look at the National Basketball League and so many African Americans are so good at that and they're much better than other people, that's probably partly an inherited, tendency. Certainly, being good at things where you have to be big and strong, that's inherited, okay? Other things, it's so much harder to tell, and it's quite clear that there's been a lot of social and environmental effect on people. I mean, one of the biggest examples that we've seen in science, medicine, and so on, is that if you go back 100 years, the idea of women practicing any of those disciplines, there were a few here and there, but very few, and most male scientists would have said, no, that women are just not capable of thinking this way. And it's completely wrong. There are brilliant women scientists. I know quite a few personally. And it's quite clear that their non-participation had nothing to do with genetic differences between men and women. And there are all sorts of things like that. And my basic take on this is that, this is not the way we should be thinking about these problems. We should be thinking, so again, it comes back to science. When you think about something scientifically, you're always skeptical. You don't say, oh, I know what the answer is about this. So it's quite clear a lot of these questions about, do African Americans have more of a genetic skill for basketball, or do white people, which I don't believe, have more of a genetic skill for math and science, or something like that? So you think about a question like that as a scientist, and you say, there might be some evidence more on the basketball side, I think, that there are differences like that, but it's very hazy. It's just not. It's not something that we should take seriously, and we should also, at the same time we're thinking about it, take seriously the fact that there are all these tremendous environmental influences. So maybe, African Americans are so good at basketball because the kids are out in the street playing basketball all the time. Okay. I was not out on the street as much. It doesn't really matter. The thing is, there are all of these influences. They're complicated. So our default as a society should be, let's assume everybody's the same. Let's give them equal chances. And that means giving them equal education, equal opportunities to explore different professions. And then, we'll see what happens. It's a long-term experiment, and the answer to it is really not very important. Suppose it turns out that, there's an epsilon bit of difference between someone of Jewish descent like myself, because there are so many Jewish physicists. Maybe we have some genetic advantage. Who cares? What difference does it make? There have been physicists of all types. They've all contributed. And we just can't make decisions based on these false categories that were clearly invented originally in order to justify oppressing people.
So let's go back to the basketball player. If you consider Africans, and I've been to Africa several times, I don't think anytime I've ever seen a fat African, meaning overweight or obese or something. Usually they're very thin people, and it might be because they don't have access to great food or whatever it is. And so when you come over to America in the bottom of a ship where there's salt water you're transferring to, a lot of research has said that the reason why Black people have chronic illnesses like high blood pressure and all these things have to do something with that voyage from Africa to America. But then you further add to that, now not only are you potentially at risk for high blood pressure, you're working on the field from sun up to sundown, 6 days a week, and you're doing really hard manual labor. So your muscular structure changes because, you know, maybe when they were in Africa, maybe they might have carried their babies on their back or carried a bale on their head. Their muscles weren't developed to do what they did when they came here to America. And so what I guess I'm asking about, so this basketball player that plays so good, maybe it is because he or she spent a lot of time outside playing basketball, but it also may be that structurally the change from being an African to becoming an African American restructured their physiological person, because now they are not thin and they're not, you know, doing things the way they had done in their natural country. And so now I've been come here, made to work in a field, pick cotton, grow sugar and all those things. My body has adjusted and changed to do this. So this is giving me a skill to be better at something than I would have been if I had not, because it's not like all Africans can play basketball really well. We've seen that in the NBA over time, right? You know, so it can't be just that, you know, you're African American, or even if you like, you know, they're pretty good Africans, I understand, of soccer and things like that. But I mean, thinking about this, could it be just that there's just, as you suggested earlier, environmental things that happen to us over time that restructure our physical beings to give us gifts in one area as opposed to other areas, and one of those even being education and intellect, because, you know, slaves were prevented from reading and learning and so forth and so on. And, you know, when you got to my generation, I'm 61, I'll be 62 this year. My mother had a 4th grade education, and the mantra every day was get a good education. I didn't know what that meant, but that's what she said. And I did. And my children are, my husband, but it still hasn't changed our outcome in life, because although we can prove we can participate at the same rate with whites, blacks, browns, Jews, any kind of construct you want to come up with, there's still something about that black and brown skin that is somehow or another misaligned in the American dream, if you will.
Well, that of course is true, and it's you know, that's clearly racism, prejudice, and so on and so forth. You know, the very specific thing you said about structural changes because of it, I don't think it's enough generations from the time that people were brought over from Africa to make such a big change. The changes that have to do with thinness versus obesity, that's diet, okay? We have enormous amounts of evidence that everybody who comes here from every country, okay, the Mexicans, the Japanese, they have different diseases in the countries that they came from than they do here. And a lot of them have obesity and diabetes that are due to the way we eat in this country. And we've been spreading that way of eating around the world. So there are more people in Europe who are like that and so on. But I think that's really environmental. And it may be that certain people are more susceptible to the damage that's done by that because their own genetic history coming from a different country, you know, set them up to eat a different kind of diet than this. And maybe some other people have been eating this kind of diet for a longer time and it doesn't affect them as badly. That's conceivable. But those, my understanding at least, and let me just say up front, I'm not a biologist. I read, you know, sort of popular books on it, but I don't really know much about this. But my understanding is that it takes a lot longer than a few generations. Even, you know, 400 years is probably not enough to make big genetic changes. It can make changes in height and weight, and those come from nutrition. We're all, on average, a lot taller than people were in medieval Europe because we eat better, in some ways better than they did. Yeah, it's a complicated question, but
it is. But I read a paper, and if you're interested, I'll send it to you, someone wrote, I think it was in 2014, they wrote about the PTSD of genetics. And it talked about both all the ethnicities. Like, you know, all of us have some sort of PTSD in our gene pool, right? So, you know, the trauma that the slaves went through, which has been passed down through generations, the Holocaust, you know, like all of these different traumas that happens that is now embedded in our genes and in our DNA and how we are and how we think. I think your point about food is a very good one, but I would take you back to early slavery, you know, and if you look at some of the pictures and there's not an obese African among them, not one. I mean,
Sure.
the picture of Mammy, you know, that seems to go around a lot, and that was a caricature that someone else came up with, but that was really not possible because they were barely eating. You know, they got the scraps, so it was left over. So, as you said, you know, over time we've gone and expanded our diet so we can eat whatever we want to eat, and we it does whatever it does is to our body, whether it makes us fat, sick, whatever it is that. But somewhere there has to be some scientific evidence that says why we as a people see each other so differently. And the one thing that seems to be the commonality is the color of one's skin, not anything else that you can say. Because, you know, I know a lot of racially ambiguous people. You can't tell whether they're black, white, blue, green, or orange. You just don't know what they are. What is that? You know, and I would even go back to the Jews. I mean, like, so when you think about this, so here's a population of people who were oppressed to the point of almost destroying the entire race in Germany. And so here you get to this place where, and your point about, you know, time, look at how the short window you have come to where you are now. So I don't know that I agree 100% that 400 years is not enough, but if you look at, you know, looking at some of the old Holocaust, you know, videos and pictures and stuff like that, we see people so emancipated, so emaciated that they're just so thin, you see nothing but their bones, literally. And yet, still, your people have evolved to a point where most of you are healthy, normal, you know, none of the visual scars of the Holocaust, if you will, unless you've got something tattooed on you. But other than that, it's not visual that you had this thing happen to you. And so for Africans, the thing that at least, and I agree, I'm not a biologist, I'm a technologist, and you know, both of my children are biologists, so I'm sure they know better than I do. But there has to be some accounting for the structural change that makes people who we are today. So, you know, like I said before, like, you know, high blood pressure is more prevalent in Black people than any other race of people. And why that is, I don't know. Then you have something like, you know, the black and white disease. So my husband is a carrier. I can't think of it right now. But, and then you have on the white side, there's a white version of that same gene, you know. So, you know, Black people get, my brain is blanking on it right now so much. But, and it's really harmful to you. And white people have the same thing, but it's their version of it. They don't have it the same way we have it. But there are these things that seem to evolve in our society. And whether they come from DNA or environmental, whatever it is, it's hard to say. But there must be some scientific evidence that kind of at least points us in the right direction. Because I think if we don't start looking at this scientifically, we're going to constantly allow skin and hair and texture and all of these and religious things to guide us to thinking some kind of way about another group of people.
Well, I mean, I, I I really hesitate to sort of put science into this question. I think of this question as so much more a consequence of the pressures of society. So a difference that I think is quite uh, clear between uh, African Americans and say Jewish Americans or Italian Americans is quite clearly that African Americans look different. Some people can look at me and say, oh, he's Jewish, or some other person is Italian and so on, but you really don't really know for sure. And there are a lot of non-Jewish people who have big noses and whatever. And so it's a very, it's much harder to caricature. It was done, obviously, and there were, you know, a lot of racial animus against Jews who are racially, you know, I guess we're supposed to be fairly homogeneous, but I don't believe it because I lived in Israel where more than half the Jews look like they're Arabs.
Yep.
Okay. And the rest of them look like, they came from Russia or Ukraine or something like that.
Yeah.
So, whatever they say about Jewish DNA, it's quite clearly mixed if you go back not too many hundreds of years ago. And the big difference, in my opinion, in this country for Jews was the Holocaust. Okay, because the Holocaust made all the Americans who were anti-Semitic ashamed of what had been done, and then this was something that this enemy we were fighting against was doing, and so Jews suddenly became, some Jews were better off, but my father, for example, my father was born in 1918. He got out of college in the 30s. He was a chemist. He tried to apply for jobs around the country. So one of the stories he used to tell was that he knew there was a prejudice against Jews and he wouldn't get a job if he said he was Jewish. So he went in his neighborhood, Brownsville, in Brooklyn, he found a Baptist minister to write him a letter of recommendation. And the guy wrote him a letter of recommendation and he applied for this job and he gets a letter back saying, we're very interested in your resume. Could you please send us a picture of yourself? And he realized that what was going on is because it was a Baptist minister, they thought he might be Black and they didn't want him. And he said, okay, I don't want this job. All right. And then, he went on, the war happened, he went in the Navy, and then he went to graduate school, he became a professor. But there was a lot of, there were quotas, there were a lot of problems for Jews then. When I grew up, there was a little bit of anti-Semitism among some of the kids in my grade school, maybe in my junior high school. By high school, there was nothing, okay? And just in general, in growing up in New York in the 1950s, you did not feel anti-Semitism and you didn't feel like there were quotas and, okay. Whereas on the other hand, we know that African Americans who've been in the country a lot longer than my people were enslaved for most of that time. And then after that, there was all of this Jim Crow, and even in the North, there was segregation and people were, it was, I didn't see I went to only public schools in Brooklyn. In my grade school, I think there was one African-American girl who she was kind of light colored. I wasn't sure at the time, and I wasn't, we didn't think about that sort of stuff very much in my family. And then I knew a few kids in junior high school and high school, but very few, okay? And that was because even in New York City, the great liberal New York City, the schools were segregated, okay? And so it was, I attribute most of the differences that we see among Black people to the way they've been treated and the fact that such a large fraction of the population is poor and therefore get to eat the worst possible form of the American diet because that's what's cheapest and that's they get advertised to go out and buy McDonald's and whatever. And I think it's more that than any genetic, again, we know there are differences in diseases and maybe the high blood pressure is something that's DNA. But I think there's just so much environmental stuff in that's sort of clear and comes from social things and poverty and so on.
I think I understand what you're saying, but I don't think you're understanding what I'm asking, or maybe I'm not asking it correctly. But what I'm saying is like, so the point that you made about your nose, about Jewish people with nose, right? So there was an article in the New York Post about a year or so ago about Black Sicilians. So Sicilians, Italy, Black people from Sicilian country, part of Italy, came into America, and they were dark, and they were treated like Black people.
Mm-hmm.
And it's obvious they were not Black people because they didn't speak English clearly. So it was very obvious. But the color of their skin mattered so much that they were considered like Black people. And about 10 or 15 years ago, there was a book written called "¿Qué colores es abuelo?" What color is your grandmother? So what's the skin texture of your grandmother? And so these questions about, if the science is right that there's only a 1% difference between any ethnicity, regardless of what it is in terms of just your genetic structure, then that makes perfectly sense. But there must be something more to it than just that, because this color of your skin has so much importance in how people are treated, how they're protected, how they're, considered, so, if you take some of the old rhetoric that went around for a long time, if a Black man got in an elevator with a white woman, and white being skin color, she was afraid because this Black person was going to rob her or hurt her or rape her or whatever it is. And there's a lot of that that's pushed out here today too, so when we had the issue at the border wall where Trump was saying all the things that he was saying, and he was saying that these are rapists and killers or murderers, that exists in every part of society. There is no society that doesn't have that issue. But it seems like for Black and brown people, it's associated with us more directly, simply because of the color of our skin. And I'll say one more thing about that, so within the Black race specifically, there's this thing called colorism, right? So the lighter you are, supposedly the better off you are, the darker you are, the harder time you have. But
Jungle Fever, right?
Right.
The Spike Lee movie.
Yeah. So, in a way that the way that's managed in our society has helped pull us apart versus pushing us together. Because in slavery time, they had the person that worked in the house and the person that worked at the field. And the person who was in the field was darker because he was in the sun, he or she was in the sun all day. So when you get to where we are and try to figure out this, so on my father's side, they have some Native American in them, and they have white people in them, and they have all this stuff, and they've been trying to get an ancestral DNA check of who they are, so they can know who their ancestors are. And it's almost impossible because, there's so much mixed into what an average Black person is, more so than a brown person, because normally brown people are brown people, whether they're Mexicans, Latinx, whatever you want to call them. You have people from Middle East, they like the mixture didn't happen as much as it did for Black people, although like what you said about the Jewish, I have one of my favorite people in the world. He's the Israel deputy prime minister for finance or something. I can't remember what it is. And he's dark. He's darker than me. And he's 100% Jewish, and he's a wonderful man, just everything. But we often had these conversations of struggling with skin color, even among your own people, that the color of your skin matters, so that's why I'm hoping that one day science will kind of give us something that makes sense of this, because there's nothing logical about deciding something about a person by the way they look. So, when you met your wife, maybe she was attractive, maybe that's the kind of woman you like, maybe there's something about, like some of that I can reconcile with. But to totally disregard a person because they have darker skin or thicker lips or thicker hips or coarse hair or whatever you want to say makes no sense to me. And it's just an illogical concept to me, and I can't understand why there's not something that can really explain it to us so we can get past it.
So there's a very interesting book by a guy named Jared Diamond. It's called The World Until Yesterday. Okay, so he is he's some kind of mixture of a biologist and a not sociologist, anthropologist. So he spent a lot of time in New Guinea and various other places where people live in very, very primitive societies, and at least until very recently. And in this book, he claims, and it's anthropology, so I don't think we have really tight scientific evidence, but he says that the way people lived in tribal hunter-gatherer societies was that you stuck with your tribe, and if you saw somebody from another tribe, you killed them right away because they might kill you. That was, what experience had taught people. And so people grew up in these little tribes that were all sort of, they kept out of each other's way, but they tended to kill each other when they saw each other because they were always afraid of. And if that's something that he's claiming happened over evolutionary timescales, over, maybe a million, 2 million years that the Homo sapiens species has been around. That could be the basis for racism. Without any genetic basis for it, it's just, the way that our species lived for most of its history was in this way where you had a fear and animosity towards the other. And then when we started getting more organized societies, many more people together, I think the rulers used that. And they said, oh, those guys, they're not our religion, or they're Black, or they're this, that, or the other thing. And so we should, conquer them, kill them, whatever. And we have to protect what's ours. And we're now in the realm of politics and sociology, and that sort of. So I think if there's a scientific explanation for racism, it's probably along those lines, but it's very soft science, in my opinion. It's not the kind of thing that you can do experiments on and say, oh, is this theory right? Well, it might be right. The same guy wrote another book, a really fabulous book called Guns, Germs, and Steel, about why the Eurasian society came to dominate the world. And a lot of the things in that book are true, but he also made a very bold statement about why large mammals disappeared in North America. And it sounded very interesting. It was very plausible. It was based on some data. And later people showed that, no, he was wrong, that what happened had more to do with natural phenomena. He was attributing it to the fact that the original people who invaded America, the first humans in the Americas, killed all the large species. And that appears to be not correct. So here's a guy, he's very smart. He has really interesting, imaginative ideas about deep human history, but he's wrong, and it took a long time to have any kind of argument that he was wrong. But his take on race makes sense to me, that it's a form of tribalism, and the reason that when you're trying to think in that tribal way, the more you can recognize somebody is different, then the longer that's going to take place. And so skin color is of course something that's much more obvious.
But when you consider your people, so if what's been put out there is true, Hitler was a Jew. He was not, a WASP or whatever you want to call the average white person. To find a people that are, from best I can tell, everything I've read in Jewish history were people who were good people, contributed to society, were innovative, they were doing all these things. And this guy wakes up one morning and decides we want to exterminate all these people. And there's nothing logical about it, especially if it's true that he was a Jew. There's nothing logical about it. So your tribalism theory kind of ties into Darwin's survival of the fittest, right? But then where do we get so far apart on that? So how, like, you know, a lot of people, when we were talking about what's happening in the world around us, people point to black on black crime, right? And they make it in almost in a bubble that only black people kill black people. We kill each other. And then if you take the data and move it out a little bit further, there's way more white on white crime there is on black crime. And whether black on black crime is economics or whatever, the white on white crime holds some of the same values, you know, but still it's the black person that you must be afraid of. It's the black person that you must fear because this person is genetically inferior to me. This person is less than me, tribalism, if you will. So then you can go, let's go to the animal kingdom, right? So if you go look at a pride of lions and they're gonna go hunt for food, you know, they're not gonna kill every beast that they can eat. They're only gonna kill the ones that will survive so they can eat. And so when you kind of put that in some kind of context, it's kind of like, okay, so animals, which we can consider inferior to human beings, have some sense of what's necessary. Like, why do we need to do this? And I don't think lions and tigers particularly have a specific diet, but they like things that they like, but they're not going to go and try to slaughter the entire race of whatever that thing is that they're eating. And so now you get to mankind, and here we are, you know, since, like you said, going back 2-3 million years ago, we've been constantly trying to destroy each other, or at least one up each other somehow or another. And, you know, what I find so interesting about the parallel between Jewish people and black people is the persecution of Jews make absolutely no sense whatsoever because of someone's religion, because of someone's beliefs, but they look just like you. You know, whether their nose is big, whether their ears are big, whatever. But for the most part, the physical characteristics are almost identical. You know, slight variations here and there, but their beliefs do not align with yours. So that means they are inferior. And so when you come to black people, what we have is our skin tone, you know, our lips, our hair, you know, sometimes our size. And so we are now inferior because of this. And so when you think about it, and this is why I'm really desperate for something scientific to explain this. And I think tribalism is a very good example. But how can it be that we are still stuck in a system that is hundreds of years old? I mean, when did the Holocaust end? Wasn't it in the end of the World War II, right? That's when.
1945, right.
Right. So, you know, why is it there are still anti-Semitic people in America now? You know, we've had several of your temples bombed and, you know, shot up. What is the logic of that? You know, what sense does that make?
Well, I mean, I think it all comes down to something about people using these ideas as a way to gain power among their own group. So you know, I mean, let's be, well, I should not be political, so I won't say what I was going to say. But there are clear reasons why currently there's a lot of this going on that has to do with our politics and taking control of power and so on and so forth. And I think that's behind a lot of it. I think that, you know, some guy out there, he's got a lousy life. He had personal disappointments and whatever. He reads some thing about, oh, these people or Jews or black people are inferior, and he just starts to believe it because it makes him feel better. And then if he can convince some friends to believe it too and have a group and start having meetings and so on, then that person becomes the center of a social group and becomes powerful in whatever small way they become powerful, sometimes a really big way. And that's something that, like I say, what I think is really going on really throughout human history is that there are these things that probably have some not really genetic, but they have something to do with the way our species lived for many, many years. And by the way, there's probably some genetics in it because the animals we're most closely related to are chimpanzees. And chimpanzees are the most aggressive animals on the planet. They have wars with each other,
Yeah.
and they kill not just for food. Okay, so we probably have it in our DNA. Okay, but then what happened as society developed is that this became a way for individual people and groups to become powerful and to get stuff and to, do all the things that everybody seems to want to do, which is, have more and, you know, and I think that is the driving force more than anything else.
It's an interesting perspective. Have you read about Tulsa, Oklahoma, back in the late 1900s, early 1900s, and the Black community that survived and was
The
living,
1920s, the Black Wall Street and the massacre there. Yeah. Yeah.
and to me, I can make that parallel to the Holocaust, because here were people that were self-sufficient, were surviving. They weren't, doing anything other than existing in their own communities. And so, in my mind, and again, I'm a technologist, I'm not a scientist, thank God. I don't have to constantly prove my hypothesis. But, in a lot of ways, it's like, is that jealousy? What is it? Because the stereotype you hear about Jews, almost, you all are great with money, you can always make a gazillion dollars. And that's the stereotype that mostly you hear about Jews. They're just financiers and they're really great with money. Whereas with other communities, especially if their skin color is dramatic, so Black and brown, we had Chinese and Japanese internment camps in the United States, and they've gotten reparations, and they've done all these things the Holocaust have. But there's something about these two groups over here that is so dramatically different that it doesn't even hold logic why we feel and hold these values, unless we're either predisposed to believe that, or what you said about the story about the guy who can get a bunch of other people to believe what he believes, and off we go with this, and it just kind of persists. It doesn't go away. It doesn't ever disappear, because there's someone constantly perpetrating this story throughout history. Yep, this is the way this thing is. This is just the way they are. They're thieves, they're rapists, they're murderers. They're intellectually inferior. And I would ask you one question, one last scientific question is this. Okay, so education. So when Black people were enslaved in America, they were permitted from learning to read. The only thing they had was a Bible, and however the white plantation owner wanted to construct what they were supposed to learn out of that reading. And so here we are in 2020, and there's this perception, and I'm going to tell you this from a technology perspective, that we are intellectually inferior because of what happened way back then. So, for example, I don't know, you may not follow technology a lot, but in 2015, Google introduced this facial recognition software. Everyone that developed that software was white, and most likely male. I don't know that to be a fact, but I knew they were all white. And so whenever a face popped up that was white enough or light enough for it could put up a face. But when it counted a dark face, it would put up a gorilla.
Mm-hmm.
To me, the problem is not only a diversity of persons, but a diversity of thought. And while in a lot of ways, like as we think about how people see the world, I tell people all the time, I would give every dime I'll ever have in my life that Google did not do that intentionally. It wasn't like they wanted to get this bad press, or they wanted just to show up that they're racist or whatever it is. It's because we believe so dearly that our kind are the best kind, and our kind have all the answers. So for me, in technology, so we've got algorithms, we've got artificial intelligence, machine learning, and I can just go on biometrics and all these things. And the people that are on the fringes of it are Black and brown, not anyone else. So, when biometrics, when I can put my fingerprint or they scan my eye, maybe that'll be okay. But everything else is aligned for Black and brown people to fail. So one of my favorite stories is about algorithms. So if you live in zip code XYZ, and zip code has high poverty, crime, police presence and all this stuff, everything that is for that area, life insurance, health insurance, car insurance, whatever it is, groceries, costs more, because the algorithm says this is an at-risk category, and it's been used in banking as well. Like, so we had redlining and all that kind of stuff, but all of that's been used as formulations for justifying a behavior. And so from the technology standpoint, we are moving at the speed of sound with technology. I mean, by the end of the week, we probably won't even be human beings anymore. There'll be robots running around taking care of everything. But realistically, these things seem to continue to grow upon themselves. It's almost like putting a plant on top of a plant, just watching it grow, 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 grow. And I do think, to some degree, for Jewish people as well, there's this thing in our society that allows us to justify our behavior because we have a belief that may or may not be true about that group. I mean, I don't know this to be a fact, but maybe not all Jewish people are billionaires, and rich and financially,
That's
running the world.
definitely the case, that they're
Right.
not rich.
Right. But that's the theory, right? That
Right.
that's who they are, and you can extrapolate that not all Black people are murderers and rapists and killers. I don't think I've ever killed a bug, much less anything else. So I know I'm not that. So when you kind of think about this, I'm hoping, which is when Ann told me I could talk to you, I was so excited about this, because I'm hoping that something will come out of the scientific world, that even if it's just simply tribalism, or if it's just, survival of the fittest, or whatever construct you can put together that kind of explains why we are continuing to have these behaviors against people who have not proven to be what we say they are.
Yeah. See, my feeling is what we really need in this country more than anything else is education, good education. And we need it in so many different ways. We need it because if you want to have more Black people in technology, that's going to start to happen when you have more Black kids coming out of high schools where they've been given the opportunity to learn calculus and whatever they need to be engineers, and to go into engineering schools. And it has to start, really early, to get people to understand what, options are in the world, and to give them the training, which, it's really hard to do math if you've not been exposed to it for, enough of your life. Learn better when they're younger. And so we need education for that. We need education. If you look at what happens in the world, people's attitude towards things like this among white people, they get better when people get more educated.
Yeah.
Because they get exposed to truth, okay?
Right.
And they get exposed to history and to truth and to what the effect of being a racist does, and so on. So somehow a lot of the failure of this country has to do with the fact that we're really not good at education. And this is true even in quite affluent communities. We just don't care enough about knowledge for knowledge's sake. We care about school because we want our kids to go to a good school so they'll get a good job and make more money.
Right.
But we don't want them to go to school so that they'll, become broader people and know more about the world and understand things. It's a very narrow conception of what school is. And I don't know how to make it better. A friend of ours here in Atlanta was just telling me the other day a story that used to be when he sent his kids to school in Atlanta. There were two magnet schools in fairly affluent African-American communities. And they were like the best schools in the city for science and math. And they graduated a lot of African-American kids who came out in those disciplines. And apparently the white population was feeling resentful that if they wanted their kids to get this education, they had to send them down to these neighborhoods, even though they weren't really dangerous neighborhoods or anything like that. They were just, they were African American because housing is segregated. And that was the whole point of putting a magnet school there. And it got erased. They got rid of the magnet school program because of the resistance to that. And that is one of the saddest stories I've ever heard.
Yep. And I think that my husband is a third grade teacher, and we have these conversations almost every single day about race and education, right? So one of the things as I was doing my work for my thesis, I would go to schools, elementary schools, and observe boys and girls, because in my work, we're often told girls are not good in STEM, science, technology, engineering, math. Again, girls can't do that, And so somewhere along the way, somebody who's teaching them or leading them is dissuading them from pursuing a STEM degree or whatever it is, And then I was trying to find out whether is that the reason why there are so few women in STEM, really high powerful women in STEM, or is there something else that I'm missing? And what I came away from, and when my thesis advisor read my paper, she said, "This is the worst paper I've ever read in my life," because I had done two things. I had examined the number of girls who were interested in STEM, but I had also correlated that with the number of Black boys who were discouraged from STEM as well. And she said these two ideas are in different universes. You can't bring them together to come up with a common hypothesis that says this is this or this is that. You've got to understand why, so, and we're not just talking about Black girls, but all girls are kind of just, you go cheerlead or go teach or go the humanities, right? And boys are more geared towards science and math and all those kinds of things, and so I was trying to figure out what factors happen early on in elementary school that causes a girl to say, nope, I'm going to go become a teacher, or I'm going to go do something in humanities. And if you look at our world as a whole, there are more women in humanity fields than there are in science fields, right? And this is also true for Black people, both Black men and women, so in school, when, like, if everybody knows if you are in technology, you make a lot of money, you know a lot of things, you can fix a lot of problems, so it's good. So Black kids enroll in colleges, especially predominantly white colleges, to get a STEM degree of some kind, right? So that they can make a lot of money. That's the lure of technology, right? Because you're in high demand, we have very low unemployment, there's all these great numbers about STEM. But then you get to the point where I've done my sophomore year, and now I start to look at my major. My major is engineering, or my major is mechanics, or information technology, whatever it is. And I can't do it because I didn't get the foundation somewhere a long time ago that would help me sustain in this field. And so when I did my doctoral thesis was about online education. So completion rates. And so for colleges, completion rates matter. How many students you admit, and do they go all the way through and complete? And hopefully in 4 years, not 5 or however many, but in 4 years they complete. And so when you look at colleges and why they accept and what the criteria is of who they accept and why they accept, a Black person or a brown person who's enrolled in a STEM course, more likely than not, is going to drop before they get to that place of completion. They either will drop out of school or they'll change their major.
Yeah.
Right. So there's, in my mind, because this is what I do, and I mentor and I advocate girls everywhere, and I don't care what color they are, what their issues are, because to me, I am tired of going to the meeting or going to a conference and being the only person that looks like me. I have no community that's there. And I built a community at my university. My community is probably the most diverse of anything at the university, but my narrow, my isolated little community, so it's not very diverse. It's just me and maybe a couple, 3, 4 other Black people, but the rest is my larger community is huge, right? So predominantly white, predominantly male is huge. And so I agree with you that education is exactly has to be at the foundation. But the question is why do we keep telling girls they can't do science? And why do we not recognize that sending little Johnny out of the classroom because he can't sit still. And that was the one thing why my master's thesis had a problem with my thesis, was because I noted that boys cannot sit still for long periods of time. So if somebody's standing up there writing on the board, you know, and the boy's sitting there, his back is to the teacher or the teacher's back to the student, I mean, you bouncing around or doing something, right? And so for Black kids, that gets them thrown out of the class. You know, go to the principal's office, you're not doing this. And that's instruction that you're missing. So I will say this, it's been beautiful talking to you. I love this conversation. I just hope when you scientists get together, you start looking at this and trying to find answers that we can explain, you know, that really help our entire society think about why we have these issues and what's the value of holding on to them. You know, for me to hate you because you're a Jew is about as insane as anything I could hate. I could think, I mean, I could hate you if you said bad things to me. I could hate you if you hurt me. But because of who or what you are is insane to me to think I can't like that person.
I agree with you 100%.
You know, I just can't find a reason in the world why that would make sense. You know, and your wife, you know, when I first met her, she's such a lovely, lovely woman, you know, and so she and I connected immediately. And, you know, I consider her my friend. I can, you know, I don't think about her as a judge. I don't think about her as a white woman. I just think of her as my friend, you know, and I send her a text or a chat. I don't say, Your Honor, white Judge Ann Barnes. Hey, Ann, how are you today? You know, so I think that we need to find somewhere to get to that place where we can.
Oh, boy, I really agree with that.
Yeah. So do some more of that quantum physics and theories and things to figure out what's wrong with us. not with the planets, you know, the planets will take care of themselves. We need help.
Maybe in a few hundred years it will. Right.
Thank you.
Yeah.
This has been really, 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 really enlightening.
It was really fun. Thank you.
It really was. Thank you. I wasn't too hard on you, was I?
Sorry?
I wasn't too hard on you, was I?
No, you weren't.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Excellent. Well, thank you very much. Once this video converts, I'll send you a link to it and you can look at it. If you want me to post it, I'll post it. If not, we won't.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Stay safe and tell Ann I said hello and take care.
I will. Bye-bye.
Bye.